Alright, what's up everybody? I've just recently stumbled across this video called Sam Harris versus Libertarians and Anarchists, and I found myself pausing and responding to some of Sam's objections with libertarianism and more specifically Anarcho Capitalism. See, critiquing libertarianism is like casting a very wide net. There are conservatarians, which vary in opinion, there are minarchists, which vary in opinion, there are objectivists, there's the ANCAPs, etc. So Sam seems to be more specifically critiquing anarcho-capitalists here. And as someone with a lot of respect for Sam, I want to dig into why I disagree with some of these points, and even where I do occasionally have some agreements. So here we go.
I think we should use government and its legal machinery rather sparingly. The problem with having too many laws is that to enforce them, you need to back them up with the threat of violence. If you're going to criminalize drug use, for instance, you have decided that you're willing to send people to kick in your neighbor's door with guns drawn and haul him off to jail for doing something as innocuous as smoking pot.
Wow. Yeah, Sam, we're in total agreement so far. We want as few laws as possible because you want to minimize the use of force on society. Your example of drug laws requiring the state to enforce them by kicking down people's doors, guns drawn, and dragging them away is a perfect example of what rational people want to see less of. But let's see how far you take that.
Not only is this unethical, it's dangerous for everyone involved. And it's a patently insane use of resources. So I'm basically a libertarian in feeling that peaceful, honest people have the right to be left alone.
And now we're at the point where Sam ceases with this rational thought experiment. I think this is where a lot of people end that journey of self-ownership and property rights. So far we've established that you have a right to peacefully consume drugs and alcohol, so far as you are not imposing on anyone else or infringing on anyone else's rights. But why does this stop at the arena of drug use? Sam called it, quote, not only unethical, but dangerous for all those involved. Let's apply this same logic to taxation. Do you support the police kicking down someone's door, guns drawn, and hauling them away simply because they did not support contributing to a particular program or government measure? If someone, say, wants to opt out from Social Security because they have other ideas of how they'd like to plan their retirement, or perhaps they have no plan to live past 65 at all, do you support the police kicking their doors down and hauling them away with guns drawn for years to a federal prison? What if they just didn't want to contribute to the war campaigns? Or if they didn't like being robbed to bail out megacorporations and banks who misused their resources and gambled and lost? This same logic applies to those people as well. In fact, this same logic applies to people who object to even the most popular of society's ideas. In the case of anarcho-capitalists, the idea that the government has a right to forcefully seize your wealth to provide even for police, national defense, roads, and courts is every bit as much of an infringement as being forced to pay taxes for the ridiculous things already mentioned, because the issue is the use of force against nonviolent people.
And I do think government should get out of our lives when what it is doing is harmful or wasteful. But I think it should do those things that markets can't do efficiently or won't do at all. So I'm not a doctrinaire libertarian in any sense. You clearly can't privatize everything.
Unfortunately, Sam doesn't go on to give any specific reasons for this, because there is a wealth of libertarian literature and theory on how all of the services that I mentioned above can be provided by private enterprise. In fact, I've done a few videos here on this channel in my Stateless Solutions series about how defense, policing alternatives, fire departments, insurance, roads, money, courts, rules, licensing, security, quality food standards, healthcare, and other concerns can be provided by the market and more efficiently, with more options to the masses, with no violations to their right to be left alone and keep the fruits of their labor. I understand having disagreements with the proposals, but when people act like the ideas are not out there, it tells me they just haven't researched it. Read Murray Rothbard's For New Liberty, Ethics of Liberty. Read Anatomy of the State. Anatomy of the State is about 60 pages long. It's more like a pamphlet than a book. But it will shed a lot of light on what the government is, what the government is not, and what the government cannot be. It'll shed a lot of light on the reality of the state. You can read Lysander Spooner's No Treason, the Constitution of No Authority, which I just recently read, and it was mind-blowing. Read Walter Block's Defending the Undefendable. I recently also finished Sam Konkin's Agorist Primer, which was amazing. Read Stefan Molyneux's Practical Anarchy. There's no shortage of brilliant ideas that have been proposed over the years. To act as if none of them are feasible without a centralized monopoly on force, which funds itself through theft of the citizenry, is really just indicative of lazy, irrational thinking, in my opinion.
And all the anarchists running around attacking people for, quote, worshiping the religion of the state should probably spend a little time in countries where the state is weak and people take the law into their own hands. The results are never pretty.
I'm curious which countries Sam is referring to, and I wish he would be specific, because the implication here is that these places that he's talking about have a very libertarian approach to state governance. I don't know of any such places existing today. Are we talking about third world countries with a revolving door of revolutionary leaders who operate under military rule? I would hardly call that a libertarian system. I don't think some impoverished Middle Eastern or African nation is operating under the writings of Rothbard, for instance.
Right. I mean, we need a strong state to keep order. We need the police and the military. We need a state that has a true monopoly on the use of violence.
Yeah, what harm could possibly come out of that? It's not like a centralized authority with the exclusive power to create laws, enforce laws, seize wealth, print wealth, and start war has ever abused that power, right? What do we know about power? We know power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. You cannot know that and understand that reality and just turn a blind eye to the fact that every state grows in power and every state abuses that power to one extent or another. A state merely existing as we've defined it is a threat to the life, liberty, and property of the masses. It cannot be said to defend property when it exists through the coercion and theft of that property. There are actions that have to be enforced in any civilized society, and those actions are restricted to property right violations: theft, assault, murder, and fraud. Knowing that force must be used to prevent those actions or to seek restitution for those actions, you do not want a coercive monopoly to have an exclusive right to provide that service. You want institutions, plural, handling those services to be decentralized and directly accountable as much as possible. For this reason, the state is less efficient in terms of accountability and totally contradictory in terms of protecting rights. Again, it can't be said to protect property rights if it exists as a violation of those rights.
We need a strong state to keep order. We need the police and the military. We need a state that has a true monopoly on the use of violence, so that people don't feel the need to be violent themselves.
Sam, you're using the argument that we need a government because people can't be trusted. People can be evil, vile, cruel, vindictive, and untrustworthy. So therefore, in your mind, we need a monopoly power on the most important aspects of society, which will be ran by people. Let's take a little peek at the body count and the bloodbath that was the 20th century. Do we really need to? Aside from the 2 world wars and all the other wars that took place in the last century, it's estimated that somewhere between 150 to 200 million people were murdered by their own governments. Democide is a term which means the intentional killing of an unarmed or disarmed person by government agents acting in their authoritative capacity and pursuant to the government policy or high command. Somewhere between 150 to 200 million dead bodies. And we can't be exact with that number, so we have to round it to the nearest tens of millions. Stalin, Mao, Hitler, Pol Pot, the list goes on of evil, vile, cruel, vindictive, and untrustworthy people who flocked to the halls of power and imposed their madness on society. It's just more evidence of why you cannot have a state. Compare this to the private sector under Anarcho Capitalism. Everything is decentralized, and everything is voluntarily funded. There is no central bank to finance empire expansions and war efforts. There is no power of the pen to round up political dissidents. There's also no monopoly on firearms. In the free market, bad people exist, and evil people can run private organizations. And the rest of us can choose to not provide them with revenue. And if they aggress on us, there still exists avenues of defense and restitution. A private sector would-be dictator goes nowhere in a free market without the coercive power of the state to use force and finance them. Here's a perfect example even in the current status system, and I know Sam was not a fan of Donald Trump, this is why I posed this question to him. Where did Donald Trump threaten you the most? When he hosted The Apprentice and ran a chain of hotels? Or when he had the nuclear codes and was the commander-in-chief of the greatest military the world has ever seen? I rest my case.
But the power of the state really needs to be reserved for things that safeguard human well-being, and it needs to do it in ways that make sense. There was a related question here about Chomsky. Chomsky says new atheism is state worship in disguise. You don't subscribe to state communism or fascism, but at the same time, I don't see anything in your writings against the concept of the state. Do you believe states are necessary evils? Would that count as state worship? I'm sympathetic with having as little government as is compatible with human well-being.
I believe you, Sam. I really do, but the amount of government compatible with human well-being is zero. I'll admit that I think your take on libertarianism is much more rational than I had previously thought before I found this video. I thought Sam's take was much more basic bitch lefty, like Dawkins or Krauss or Dillahunty. Obviously, I have some disagreements, but he seems to have actually put a little bit of thought into this, instead of just dismissing it like most left-wingers do. Like the TYT or Sam Cedar types who just mock it and think everything about it is stupid. So kudos for that, Sam. But although it's unpopular and even though it seems extreme, it's logically consistent, and that's what people miss about anarcho capitalism. It's just a deontological evaluation of the argument from property rights, and consistently applying logic to each issue. And this is where you end up if you do that.
But human well-being is the point, right? And in some ways, we want the state to be more efficient and powerful than it is. So ask yourself, if you ever needed the cops, really needed them, because your life or the life of someone you love depended on it, how long would you want to wait for them to show up? Would you want them there in 2 seconds? Well, that's Minority Report, right? How strong a state would you need to manage that? No doubt there would be unintended consequences of having that kind of response time.
The problem, of course, is that any state so big that the cops could be at your door within 2 seconds is a police state where your rights are almost certainly going to be abused on a regular basis. Prisons don't have a response time that good, and it's literally people in cages under constant surveillance with guards roaming the halls. This is also why a free people retain the right to own and carry firearms, Sam. The argument you just made is a perfect ad for constitutional carry, in my opinion. I would argue that instead of calling the cops and have them show up an hour late, kick your door down and shoot your dog, that the people you call for your dispute resolution are the people you've personally chosen and directly finance to solve your disputes. Personally, I'm not hiring a heavy-handed, all-guns-blazing dispute resolution provider to come to my place and blow holes through my wall, or me. And in the current system, if that happens, the cop most likely keeps his spot on the force, gets paid leave, and or gets a retirement pension that my grieving family members are forced to pay for.
So it's always a balancing act between things like security and freedom and privacy. But I'm pretty confident that the world isn't ready for a stateless utopia that's like Burning Man for 7 billion people. Okay, maybe in 100 years, or maybe in 1,000.
So you're telling me there's a chance? Yeah!
But really, I gotta give props where it's due. I think this is the goal. And I'm not saying the switch can happen tomorrow. The preferable path, in my opinion, would be a gradual one. But it still needs to be the goal. It has to start with the ideas, and it has to start with just showing people that it's possible to go the other way with government. Instead of constant expansion and more theft, more rights abuses, that it needs to be reversed and restricted, and eventually it can be entirely eliminated. Before I go, I want to give a shout out to a much bigger channel than this one, Keith Knight's Don't Tread on Anyone. He posts videos regularly, and they're usually interviews with ANCAPs and libertarians, small government types, that are really worth watching. Specifically, I wanted to give the man a shout out for this particular video he did on Sam Harris's interview with Ben Shapiro, where Sam talked about the externalities of society and why libertarian boycotts are too blunt a tool for solving issues like factory smoke blowing over your fence in a private society. Keith absolutely demolished that take. I mean, absolutely pounded it into the goddamn pavement. I'll link that in the description, but for now, I'm out. I hope everybody enjoyed it, and I will see you dudes later.